Hello everybody, this is a lesson, an introduction to compression, which I know is a topic that a lot of people are confused about, curious about, hear a lot about, and this is going to clear up a whole lot for you. We're going to start with the basics. We're going to start with what a compressor is, what its purpose is, how it works. I'm going to show you a couple different versions of compressors out there. It's nothing to be intimidated by, that's for darn sure, and by the end of this, you'll be an expert in compression, and you can start using it in your mixes. My guess would be that you're using it already, but you're not quite sure why or what it's doing. You just know that you're supposed to, right? First, let me give you an example of a tune that we're working on here so you can get an idea of the song. And that's a song by Johnny Oskam, who's actually my brother, a fantastic blues artist. Anyway, you'll be hearing a lot of his music and my own music throughout the course of these lessons. So as you can see, we're working in Studio One today, and what DAW we're working in doesn't particularly matter because this is just a lesson on compression, and compressors are prevalent in all DAWs. That being said, to get going, I'm not going to use a third-party plugin. I'm going to use one that comes stock with your digital audio workstation. So if you're working in Studio One, you'll probably see something called compressor, for example. And a lot of times, where you'll mostly see compression being used are in dynamic instruments, or things with, another way of putting that is things that, instruments that have very loud parts and very soft parts. And the whole purpose, so for example, I'm going to be looking at a snare drum just to make it very, very straightforward for you. Actually, let's do it on a snare drum later. Let's do a vocal first, because as you can imagine, a vocal, there are parts where your vocalist may be, louder, and then he or she may sing a line softer. And the whole point of compression is to level out those two parts. It's really the easiest way to explain it. You want to bring the louder parts down in volume, or attenuate. Okay, get familiar with that word, attenuation, meaning bringing down in volume the loud parts, and then you want to boost or amplify the quieter parts so that the gap between the loudest part and the softest part is lessened, or that range of dynamic information is compressed. Okay, that's really all a compressor does. And so there are certain settings on a compressor that will help you in shaping the sound that you get depending on what you want to do. So here's what we're going to do. On his vocals here, I'm using two instances of I'm using a vocal that's doubled, and then I'm processing them both separately. I'm using a plugin called Isotope Nectar, which is kind of an all-in-one plugin in that it has multiple parameters and effects built into it. So it has EQ, compression, effects, reverb, and you can manipulate all of those things, and it kind of saves on processing power. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm only looking at compressors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bypass the compressor unit in this vocal performance, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the Studio One compressor right underneath it. So this is a basic compressor. This has all of the parameters that most compressors in all of the other digital audio workstations will have, whether it's Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton, Cubase. All of these things will have some sort of compressor that comes stock with it, and it will have these controls. So I'm going to walk you through these controls and what they actually mean and how they affect the sound. So first, let's solo up the vocal that I just put this on.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me.
Okay, so just so we get the full idea, I'm going to bypass, because still in Nectar we have other things going on. We have multiple delays, we have reverb, we have other things that are making it sound processed and polished and finished. So what I'm going to do is bypass this plugin altogether, and all we're going to deal with is the dynamic range and the compressor that comes stock with Studio One. So let's listen to it with just that.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing.
And I apologize, let me get this. There we go.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost.
Now this is just the setting that it came in when I threw it on. So let's go through this. Ratio, I'll explain that in a little bit. Threshold, it's very important to understand. The threshold is the invisible line that we are setting so that whenever the volume or the amplitude of the audio passing through the compressor crosses that particular threshold, which by default right here is at negative 15 decibels, anytime the volume goes over negative 15 decibels, the compressor will start to compress or attenuate the volume, bring it down. So the threshold is a very important setting that we have to get right, and we have to, essentially you have to nail it. It's one of the most important settings, if not the most important setting. It will help determine how much compression is going on, in addition to the ratio, but as I said, I'll explain that in a minute. So let's take a look.
Now you see me.
So you can understand the metering here too. We have the in coming in here on the left. This is the volume as it comes in. And then this is the volume on the way out. And up here you're going to see this meter. And this is showing you how much the volume of the signal passing through it is being attenuated. And you can even see a digital representation of the amount here.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost.
So at the loudest part, where we go the furthest over negative 15 dB, it's knocking off 3.9 decibels, which is pretty moderate. You know, it's pretty simple. It's actually a pretty solid setting. It's not a coincidence that they set it right there. So that's important. Understand threshold. Let's look at some other common parameters on a compressor. We have the attack and the release. Now, to some of you out there who are familiar with compression, a lot of this may seem really elementary, and good for you. If you can really wrap your head around attack, release, threshold, these kinds of things, then the more you practice it, the more you keep doing it, the better you'll get at it, and the better your mixes will become. For those of you who are watching this, I assume that this is all very new to you, so I'm explaining it in a very simplistic way that once you'll be able to wrap your head around it, then you can start applying it to your mixes as well. So the attack time is pretty much just what it sounds like. It's the amount of time the compressor will take to react once the level has crossed your threshold. So as soon as the level crosses negative 15 dB, how quickly do you want the compressor to clamp down and start attenuating that level? So 15 milliseconds is a pretty quick attack time. You can obviously make it much shorter. A longer attack time would be something, I should take that back. 15 milliseconds is a pretty moderate attack time. You can make it much longer, of course. And I'll play it back and I'll play with this, and you can actually hear audibly the difference. And then you could see how you maybe wanted to use that to your advantage or disadvantage, especially when you're dealing with compressing something like a snare drum. When you want that transient, meaning the very first part of the snare to come through, you don't want the compressor to immediately attack down on that, because that's the part that you want to cut through the mix. And we'll get to that when I show you the snare here in a minute. The release time is the exact opposite. So as soon as the level of the audio drops below the threshold, meaning it's no longer needs to be attenuated, how long do you want for that compressor to release its hold on the audio? Okay, and the different settings there in terms of milliseconds can have a vast difference on the sound as well. You may also see on some compressors things like auto, adaptive is kind of a Studio One term. Auto would mean it's going to read the envelope of the waveform itself and determine on its own what the best release time and attack time may be. That's always an option. If you like that, the way that sounds, by all means, go for it. But I think that's kind of a way around learning what this really means. So I really suggest getting your hands dirty, getting in there, playing with attack and release times, and really understanding what's going on. A new feature on a lot of compressors that you see is something called the mix, and this is not, as I said, this is new. This is not on all compressors, and the idea behind this really lies more in parallel compression, which I'll be doing a lesson on for you guys. But the idea being, quite simply, and I won't go too much into it, you can overcompress something on purpose, meaning it sounds just very, very squashed and very, 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 very compressed. And if you had it processed that way on its own, it would sound very unnatural, okay? But there are certain elements to the sound that are desirable. So what you could do is, and I could show you this here in a second too, you can overcompress the heck out of something, okay? And then what you do is you can blend the mix. So right now, if the mix is at 100%, you're hearing 100% of what is being processed by your compressor settings, okay? So in the event that we had the vocal, for example, absolutely squashed because we liked the way that it was kind of in your face, but we didn't want it to just have that. We wanted some of the original sound to be blended with it. We could back the mix off to say 50%, and now we would have half of the original performance with no sort of compression on it, and half of the overcompressed, squashed sound, and they would be blended together to give kind of a more natural, yet still in-your-face kind of sound. It's a really cool feature that never used to really be built into the unit. There was always a way to do it by way of setting up parallel compression chains and things like that. And I still think that's a valuable skill to know how to do. And of course, there'll be lessons on that down the road as well. But an easier way for people who are in the mood to save some time, use things like these mix knobs, and developers of plugins have started implementing them, and I think it's a good thing because time is important, especially if you're working for a client or whatever the situation may be. So let's get into this a little bit more. Let's get into ratio for a second. The best way I can explain ratio is so a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning for every 2 dBs over the threshold, there will be 1 dB of attenuation. And maybe that's a little too scientific. We can come back to ratio. Let's wrap our heads around some of the more basic things. Just understand this. Compression and limiting are the same thing. There's only one parameter that separates the two. Okay? If you look at the controls on a compressor and the controls on a limiter, they're identical. The only thing that separates them is the ratio, okay? So most compressors are going to compress at 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, all the way up to 6-to-1, 8-to-1. As soon as you go past 10-to-1 in the ratio department, you're technically limiting at that point. And I'm going to explain ratio more in the limiting lesson, so check that one out when that one gets thrown up. But just understand that compression and limiting are the same idea, the same exact thing, except for the ratio, and that plays a bigger part. So just know that standard ratios for compression on things like vocals, snare drums, there's anywhere from 2-to-1 to 8-to-1, usually more around 4-to-1. Those are just pretty much the go-to ratios for compression. So as you can see, they start you out at 2-to-1. I like to compress vocals closer to 4-to-1 or 3-to-1, so we'll set this to 4-to-1. And let's just let this loop for a sec. Let me take a listen here.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost.
So I like that, around 17. It feels like it's a little bit more in your face. The knee, by the way, I didn't touch on that. Not all compressors have a knee setting either. The knee is actually very, very simple, and they give you a very good visual representation of what it means right here. You see this slant? First of all, let's take a look at this diagram as this is playing. What does this actually mean?
Now you see me.
See the blue dot that comes up? Well, this light blue dot represents our threshold, okay? And the dark blue dot that comes up is the waveform or the volume of the waveform as it's passing and dipping above and below the threshold. So you kind of get a visual representation. Well, the knee is this curve. So in essence, it's how quickly well, look, if I adjust it, for example, you see how the curve smooths out, which would in essence kind of smooth the compression. If you wanted a hard knee like that, it's almost like it has an angle to it, then that of course would be a different sound. Most of the time you kind of just want a moderate to soft knee, but again, it depends on the instrumentation. We can get into that. Again, this is kind of just for basics. So let's take a look at this again.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me.
Okay, so the attack for me is a little bit too slow. So I'm going to bring it down to about...
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me.
Yeah, that feels a little bit more natural. And I'm also going to, in the way that he phrases things, now you see me, now you don't. There's time. I'm actually going to lengthen the release time a little bit.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now
Okay, let's talk about these two parameters, input gain and gain. So, input gain, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about gain. What this really means is as you notice, the most this signal is being attenuated is 8.37 decibels. Now that's audibly noticeable, and I can prove it to you. If I bypass this plugin while it's playing, you'll notice that while it's in bypass, the vocal sounds louder. Here it is on.
Now you see me,
Off.
now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me,
Off.
now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now.
So what we have to do is we have to make up that gain, okay? So what we should do is bring it up. It's only peaking at about 8. I would bring it up. It looks like it's averaging probably around 5 dB.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost.
And the best way you can tell is actually not by looking at any sort of metering or anything like that, is by bypassing and unbypassing. If in doing so, while it's playing, you bypass, you unbypass, the volume stays the same. Now understand that the tone may change because the compressor is doing its thing, but the volume, if the volume remains the same as you're bypassing, then you know that your makeup gain is set correctly. So let's see.
Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you don't. I'm disappearing like a ghost.
That sounds pretty darn close to me. Maybe knock it off just a little bit, or closer to 4 dB. That's it. So that input gain is set correctly. So these are some basics, okay? I think we kind of nailed it. This is not, I'm not really using this compressor to add flavor or style or anything like that, because there are other compressors in the market. This is why people pay lots of money for, bundles of plugins and things, because these types of compressors are emulated based on old hardware units because they had these specific characteristics to them and sounds that people desire. Most of the compressors that come stock with your DAW do not add any sort of flavor, maybe a little bit. The only tonality change you're hearing is actually just compression. There's no like circuitry emulation or anything weird like that. So this is basic, right? This is me just helping to level out the vocal. So if I were to kick on the rest of my effects, for example, this would actually sound pretty darn good.
Now you see me, now you don't. Disappearing like a ghost. Now you.
And of course, if we put it in context.
Now you see me, now you don't. Disappearing like a ghost. Now you see me, now you see me, now you don't. Disappearing like a ghost. On my shoulders, one on each side. Fallen angels getting close.
Alright, so pretty cool, right? Let me show you a snare example real quick. and we'll call it a day on the basics of compression. In my more advanced compression lessons, I'm going to give you a taste of some of those more expensive compressors that I mentioned, and some of them are very simplistic. Some, for example, the LA2A only has two real knobs, two real potentiometers that you have to set. You have to nail those two settings, but once you get it to the sweet spot, it really can sound pretty magical. Let's take a listen to a snare. And this snare has some samples going on, has some cool stuff. Let's take a listen here. Let's set a loop. All right, so this is being compressed using an SSL channel, okay? I'll show you this, speaking of expensive compressors. I'm going to show you, though, that the settings here are even more simplistic than the one we were just looking at. Never mind any of this. This right here, this is all filters and EQ, this whole left side. Right here, this top section, see where it says dynamics? Do some of these look familiar? We have ratio, threshold, and release. That's it. This, don't worry about this in the green. This is the gate. Okay, we'll talk about gating in another lesson. This is our output. Don't worry about this. All we're looking at are these three settings. So you'll notice I'm actually compressing it at a very high ratio, almost 10 to 1. So it's almost limiting. In fact, I should back that off maybe a little bit. The threshold is 13 dB attenuating. Now you'll notice the metering here is in yellow. So as it's compressing, you'll see these light up. That's about 6 dB of attenuation, okay? Now that output makeup gain, you'll notice there's no output makeup gain potentiometer here. That's what this is. That's where this fader comes into play. So here is our release time, 0.36 seconds. In other words, 36 milliseconds. That's a pretty, as I mentioned, around 15 was pretty moderate. 36 milliseconds is a pretty slowish release time. And that's good, because if you were to release the snare compression really quickly, it would sound like the snap came through, and it would just sound a little goofy. Now it wouldn't kill it. In fact, let me proof of concept. Let me lengthen it quite a bit. So just notice it's a little snappier. Now it has this button here, fast attack, and you could just in other words, it's faster than you could possibly imagine. It doesn't even matter what this is. So there is no attack setting. It's either fast or moderate to slow. Do you hear the difference? Listen, so this is what I was mentioning before. If you have too fast of an attack on a snare drum, or something transient heavy, where you want the first part to get through, because that's the part that's going to cut through the mix. If you have too fast of an attack, it'll crush down that transient, and it'll disappear. So here it is with fast attack. Tell me if this snare drum sounds strange to you. All of the attack of the snare drum is gone. Let me turn that off. Now listen to it. I'll switch it back. This is what I was saying at the onset of the lesson. Learning how to use attack and release times is extremely important, and it varies depending on what type of instrument you're compressing. Be it a vocal, snare drum, guitar, they all have the right settings that you need to figure out. So this is just a look at a different instrument and a different look at a different interface of a different type of compressor. And I'll be taking a look at a lot more of those from all kinds of different manufacturers in my advanced compression tutorials. So hope you guys like this. Stick around. Plenty more to come. See you next time.